The first real clash between me and the neighborhood's self-appointed dictator came on a warm Saturday afternoon, when the lake behind my home shimmered under the late spring sun, and a group of friends had gathered at my place for what was supposed to be nothing more than a peaceful day of barbecuing, fishing, and enjoying the calm water. I had purchased my property 3 years earlier, specifically because it included private lake access, deeded in black and white within my title documents. And I had made it clear from day one that my shoreline was mine alone to maintain and enjoy. That didn't stop the HOA busybody, everyone referred to as Karen, a woman with a permanent scowl and an inflated sense of authority, from marching onto my dock with the kind of energy you'd expect from a sheriff raiding a crime scene. Didn't greet anyone, didn't introduce herself, didn't even pause to assess the situation. She pointed her finger at my guests as though they were trespassers on federal land, and barked out an order that my friends pack up their fishing poles and leave immediately, because according to her, the HOA doesn't allow gatherings on community water. The moment was so absurd it nearly broke into laughter, but the tension in her voice carried a sharp edge, the kind of false confidence of someone used to intimidating neighbors into silence. My guests froze, their eyes darting to me, unsure if this was some kind of legitimate rule enforcement or just another power trip from the woman who believed every square inch of the neighborhood fell under her dominion. For a few seconds I let her rant about unsanctioned activities and violation notices piling up in her folder, watching the way she puffed up with satisfaction at the sound of her own threats. What Karen didn't realize, what she had no clue about, was that the one property in this entire HOA that she could not touch was mine. Because my land predated the association itself and came with grandfathered rights she had zero jurisdiction over. And in that moment, standing on the dock with my friends looking for answers and Karen's voice screeching like nails on a chalkboard, I knew it was finally time to show her exactly what private ownership meant. Asterisk, the silence that followed Karen's outburst was the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from shock. The uneasy quiet, where people are waiting for someone to either apologize or explode. My friends glanced at each other, then back at me, as if unsure whether they should actually leave to avoid trouble or laugh off the ridiculousness of what had just happened. Karen, sensing hesitation, doubled down with her voice raised an octave higher, shouting about community guidelines and restricted use areas, pulling a clipboard from under her arm like she was about to hand me a parking ticket on my own dock. Her presence alone was offensive enough, but the way she held that clipboard, tapping it against her hip like a weapon, showed me exactly how many neighbors she'd probably bullied into submission over the years. I stepped forward calmly, placing myself between her and my guests, making it very clear with my body language that her authority stopped where my property line began. I told her plainly that this lakefront was deeded into my purchase agreement long before the HOA was ever formed, that my rights to host friends and use the water were locked into county records, and that if she wanted to challenge me, she'd have to bring more than an empty clipboard and a bad attitude. Karen's face tightened, her lips pulling into the thin smile of someone who doesn't like being corrected, and she immediately snapped back that all property in this community falls under HOA jurisdiction, her voice carrying the smugness of someone who'd repeated that same lie so many times it had become truth in her own mind. I could see the heat rise in her cheeks as I calmly told her she was trespassing, and if she didn't step off my dock within the next 2 minutes, I would call the county sheriff and let him remind her what private property really meant. The moment those words left my mouth, the atmosphere shifted. My guests let out small murmurs of approval, some smirking as they watched Karen blink in disbelief, as though no one had ever dared talk back to her before. She sputtered something about heavy fines and board review, her tone wobbling, just enough to betray the fact that she wasn't as confident as she wanted everyone to believe. For the first time, it wasn't just me standing up to her, it was a dock full of witnesses. People who had seen the HOA tyrant try to strip me of rights she had no claim to, and that collective energy was like a wall she couldn't push through. I didn't raise my voice, didn't move aggressively, but every word I spoke carried the weight of legal truth that she couldn't escape from. Karen had expected to kick a few rule-breaking guests off the lake and walk away victorious. Instead, she stood frozen on the planks of my dock, realizing that the narrative she had spun for years was unraveling in real time. Karen didn't leave right away, of course. People like her never retreat without trying to salvage a shred of authority, and you could practically see the gears in her head grinding as she tried to think of her next move. She tucked her clipboard tighter against her chest, eyes darting from my guests back to me, her jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. Then she launched into another tirade, this time about how she had board approval to oversee all activities involving the lake and how I was setting a dangerous precedent by allowing outsiders to use what she repeatedly referred to as our communal resource. The words came out rehearsed, like she'd used the same speech on half the neighborhood before. But the problem for her was that my shoreline wasn't communal, it was private, locked down in a way the HOA couldn't touch, no matter how many times she said otherwise. I let her finish her speech. because there was something satisfying about watching her twist herself into knots. Then calmly told her that the next time she used the words communal resource in reference to my land, I would file a formal harassment complaint and add her name to a legal record she would never be able to scrub clean. That hit harder than I expected. Karen blinked rapidly, color flooding her cheeks, and for the first time since she had stomped onto my dock, she lost her rhythm. She stuttered out half a sentence about misunderstandings and clarifications, then trailed off when one of my guests, an attorney, ironically chuckled and muttered, "She's got no leg to stand on." That laugh cut through the tension like a blade, and suddenly the balance of power shifted. My guests, who had been hesitant and quiet before, now leaned back in their chairs, sipped their drinks, and smirked openly, no longer intimidated by her manufactured authority. Karen's voice cracked when she tried to recover, and instead of barking orders, she mumbled threats about upcoming hearings and possible liens, as though tossing out legal buzzwords could still scare us into obedience. But I could see it in her posture, the rigid spine, the clenched fists, the quick breaths that she knew she was in over her head. I told her, firmly and slowly, that this dock, this shoreline, and every inch of the lakefront touching my deeded boundaries, were mine, and neither she nor her HOA board had any legal right to touch it. "You are standing on private property," I said, my voice low but sharp. "And unless you plan on explaining to a sheriff why you're trespassing here, I suggest you step back now." My guests fell silent, all eyes on her, waiting to see if she had the courage to test me. For the first time in her reign of intimidation, Karen looked small, not physically, but in spirit. Becko's the wall of legal reality had finally boxed her in. Karen finally stormed off my dock that afternoon, heels clacking against the planks like gunfire, her parting words, a shrill warning that I would hear from the board. My guests laughed it off, but I knew better. People like Karen never accept defeat gracefully, and her pride wouldn't let her walk away without plotting some form of revenge. Sure enough, 3 days later, I came home from work to find a thick envelope taped to my front door, stamped with the HOAS logo in bold letters and stuffed full of citations that read like a laundry list of imagined crimes. According to the letter, I had violated rules about unapproved gatherings, disruptive use of common areas, and even unlawful use of watercraft, despite the fact that not one of those rules applied to my land or my lake rights. It was laughable, but also infuriating, an obvious attempt to paper me into submission with empty threats. My attorney friend, the same one who had been on the dock that day, told me to keep every single document, because what Karen was doing bordered on harassment and could eventually expose the entire HOA to legal liability. And he was right. The pattern was obvious. Each letter grew more desperate, escalating from friendly reminders to final warnings, written in the same clipped, condescending tone that practically screamed Karen's authorship. She wanted me rattled, wanted me nervous enough to cave in and hand her the victory she thought she deserved. But the more I read her words, the more I realized how weak her position really was, like a child waving a plastic sword and insisting it was sharp steel. Instead of backing down, I drafted a response of my own, complete with photocopies of my deed, highlighted county records, and a blunt reminder that her so-called authority stopped at my property line. I sent it certified mail, not just to the HOA board, but to the county office as well, ensuring there would be a permanent record of her overreach. By the time I sealed the envelope and dropped it at the post office, I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was putting Karen on notice that the days of unchecked intimidation were over. She had crossed into the wrong territory, and whether she realized it yet or not, her crusade was about to collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. Karen didn't waste time regrouping. Within a week, the HOA board scheduled what they called a mandatory compliance hearing at the community center, and the notice was slid under my door like some mob-style summons. The letter, again dripping with legal-sounding nonsense, claimed I was in violation of community trust and demanded my immediate cooperation. It was laughable, but also revealing. Karen had managed to drag the board into her personal vendetta, dressing it up as official business. I showed up to that meeting early, dressed in a plain button-down shirt, carrying a slim folder with every document I needed, while Karen strutted around the hall like a queen preparing to preside over her own coronation. The room was packed with board members, a few nosy neighbors, and Karen's small entourage of sycophants who nodded along at everything she said as if it were gospel. She wasted no time, launching into a tirade about property misuse and undermining community harmony, punctuating her every sentence with wild hand gestures meant to underline her authority. But when she finally demanded that I cease all unauthorized gatherings by the lake, I calmly opened my folder and laid the deed across the table for everyone to see, pointing to the highlighted section where it clearly defined the lakefront as private property under my ownership, not HOA jurisdiction. The silence that followed was almost comical, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the nervous shifting of board members, who realized they had been pulled into a battle they could not win. Karen's face flushed crimson as she stammered, trying to redirect the conversation to spirit of the rules and community cohesion. But it was obvious the ground had disappeared beneath her. I didn't raise my voice once. I simply read from county codes, state law, and the HOA's own bylaws, dismantling her accusations line by line until the board looked more like a jury, ready to acquit me than allies prepared to enforce her crusade. By the time I finished, Karen was gripping her stack of papers so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her power slipping away in real time. The board adjourned without action, muttering about needing further review, but the damage was Duncaren's empire of intimidation had cracked, and everyone in that room could feel it. Asterisk humiliation at the board meeting only made Karen more dangerous. Because instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts like a cornered animal that suddenly realizes its claws are all it has left. Within days, county code inspectors started showing up at my property unannounced, clipboard in hand, as if some invisible string had been pulled behind the scenes. They checked my deck for structural integrity, examined my boat dock for safety compliance, and even measured the slope of my driveway. All with an oddly apologetic tone that told me they knew they were wasting their time. One inspector actually muttered, "Off the record, someone's been making a lot of calls about you," before shrugging and leaving empty. Then came the sheriff's deputy. Responding to a noise complaint that didn't exist, my guests and I had been sitting quietly on the patio, sipping iced tea, when he rolled up, looking as embarrassed as I was irritated. Karen had expanded her campaign from HOA rules to weaponizing local government, hoping the barrage of inspections and police visits would wear me down. What she didn't realize was that every bogus complaint left a paper trail, and every wasted manner by county officials was more evidence of harassment that I carefully documented. I created a binder thick enough to slam down on a desk with authority, filled with dates, times, inspector names, and the outcomes of every frivolous investigation. Neighbors began to notice two words spread quickly that Karen's calls were draining taxpayer resources, and whispers started circulating that she was more liability than leader. Still, she refused to quit, standing on the lake path like a self-appointed sentry, glaring at anyone who dared set foot near my land. The image was almost pathetic, a woman who once lorded over the neighborhood reduced to pacing the shoreline, powerless but unwilling to admit defeat. Every attempt she made to bury me only dug her deeper into her own grave, and I knew it was only a matter of time before her obsession imploded in front of everyone.